On a special edition of PA Books, the author of Morning Drive, Michael Smerconish.
Michael Smerconish, author of Morning Drive. I have to ask you about the picture on the cover. When I see you on MSNBC or one of the stations being a talking head, are you dressed like that?
No, I'm not. But from the waist down, I'm probably like you'd see me now. Jeans and maybe a pair of sneakers or something. But that cover, and what's funny about it, Brian, is that the cover shot was taken by a high school intern. Maybe I'll get arrested or sued now because I'm not wearing pants and a high school intern took the picture. But she was following me for a day and taking pictures, and I was doing a hit for Hardball on MSNBC, and I had the idea that the book is intended in part to be somewhat of an unmasking of the world of television punditry and talk radio. And I thought we should take this picture. And then when the picture was taken, I immediately wanted it as the cover for the book. I did have to cajole the publisher a little bit because they weren't sure whether it was going to work. But then when the book came in and they really understood what the book was about, they were, oh yeah, we're ready to do this.
Now, you do talk radio and you do television and you have 2 newspaper columns. What does a book give you an opportunity to do that you can't do in these other media?
I guess I have something on the shelf. I enjoy writing. I really enjoy writing. I've always enjoyed writing. I went to Lehigh University as an undergraduate, and I was a journalism major, government and journalism. And writing is something that I get pleasure from doing. And I do find that I can express myself in a more thoughtful and careful manner in print than I can do on radio or on television, because you know what the world is like. When I'm in this studio and I'm hosting my talk radio program, one of 2, by the way, programs I'm now doing every day. I mean, it's an intense schedule. It's all rapid fire and it's stream of conscious, and the phone calls come in and offer a gut check and so forth. And television is much the same way, because when I'm usually on 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 9 minutes at a pop, rapid fire, soundbite oriented. There's not much of a time to be reflective and big picture oriented, and writing a book gives me that opportunity. The thoughts that I've expressed in Morning Drive, you may get in snippets from me on the radio, but I could never put it all together and paint a big picture.
Now, for somebody who's not familiar with your radio program, what
Right.
station is it and what are the 2 programs you do?
Okay, so I host 2 talk radio programs per day. Both of them, as of this past January, are now in national syndication. So I'm on the air in the morning from 6 until 9 a.m. In Pennsylvania, the morning program is heard on the Big Talker 1210, which is based here in Philadelphia and in which we're seated. And then at noon, I deliver a second program. It's also in national syndication. That program is heard not only on the Big Talker 1210 in Philly, but also on WILK in northeastern Pennsylvania. The 2 programs combined are heard on, as of this minute, 33 different radio stations across the country. I'm carried in New York City. I'm carried, obviously, in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Portland, Austin, Tampa, as of yesterday, and a whole host of other towns. So it's very new and it's very exciting for me. I wanted the program to be taken into syndication, and I've recently gotten my wish, but it came with some strings attached. And the strings for me were that I would do 2 shows a day and not just 1. So it's an insane schedule that I'm maintaining.
What's the show like?
Well, the show is topical. The show is front page news, but it's also the laughs and giggles section, and it's sports as well. You know, you're here on a day that, had you been tuned into the program, you would have heard me talk front page news. Terrorism and torture continue to be dominant issues on the front pages of the newspaper. And of course, the economic situation. And I discussed that. But I also talked about sports, and I talked about a great show that I had watched on HBO recently about Smokin' Joe Frazier and the greatest, Muhammad Ali. And I had a woman who's from the South called the Sweet Potato King, and she talked about a book that she had written about lifestyles of Southerners. So it's the full spectrum. You know, it's whatever I think is really going to be on the minds of people in their day-to-day lives, and it's a lot of lifestyle. It's a lot of what goes on, you know, with our kids, what goes on in church, and what goes on in a community, because those are the subjects I enjoy the most. I'm not known for them, but it's what I truly enjoy speaking about the most.
Is it online if somebody cannot get those radio stations?
Through the home base, the BigTalker1210.com, it is.
Now, you said earlier on that your book, you want to talk about some of the things in news talk that people might not know about. What other things, what is going on behind the scenes in a program like MSNBC or your program that people don't know about?
Well, the title of the book is Morning Drive, which is a reference to one of my 2 time slots. At the time I wrote the book, it was my only time slot. You know, morning drive, morning radio. And then the subtitle is Things I Wish I Knew Before I Started Talking, which has a twofold meaning. First, it's a reflection of the evolution of my political views. I'm not the same person that I was, I'm 47, that I was when I was 18 and first registered to vote for Ronald Reagan. My political views have changed, I think, as many of our political views change over time, and I talk about that in the book. Things I Wish I Knew Before I Started Talking is also a reflection of my evolving view of talk radio and television punditry. I used to think, by way of example, we're seated here in my radio studio, I used to think, Brian, that if the phones were ringing, then I was compelling. Well, that's not necessarily the case. I wish I recognized that many years ago. I can talk about abortion. I can mention the word guns, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania. Believe me, every line will illuminate. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm offering compelling radio. And what I've learned over time are that some of those lifestyle subjects are what people most enjoy hearing and having a piece of. And that the world of talk radio and that the world of television punditry has evolved in many senses into an artificial presentation of the political scene. And by that I mean that, and I appear on the programs that I'm now describing, many of the television producers in particular think that they have got to have liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat, red state, blue state, you know, you're a socialist, you're a fascist, that type of argumentative programming. I've never enjoyed that sort of programming. I don't believe that's the way you have to do television. It's certainly not the way that I've ever done radio. I don't hang up on people. I'm not a name caller. I have decided points of view, and I will share them with you, but I'm not here to indoctrinate. I'm not here to convince you of voting however I'm going to vote in a particular election. I'm here hopefully to inform and to entertain.
Do you think talk shows that are slanted to one side or the other, conservative or liberal, are helpful or harmful? Do they attract people to the process or drive people away?
Well, I think that largely they stifle debate, because I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that elected officials, whether it's on a state level in Pennsylvania, whether it's on a federal level in Washington, meaning Harrisburg or Washington, I think they watch the same programs that, you know, many of the rest of us who are interested in public affairs watch or listen to talk radio, and they get into this mindset that they've got to be argumentative. And I think that what they have the effect of doing is eliminating opportunities for bipartisanship and getting things done. Instead, it's either you're right, I'm wrong, you know, that sort of browbeating that takes place, and I don't think that it's healthy.
What do you think of the effect of Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert or Bill Maher?
That's actually 3 different questions, because two of their shows I've been on. One I have not. I've been on Colbert and I've been on Maher, and I write about my Maher experience extensively in the book. I like their role. I mean, I don't always like what comes out of the programs. I had a very unpleasant experience when I was a guest on Bill Maher's show. I had a funny experience when I was on Colbert's show. But I like the fact that they are getting younger people interested in public affairs. The question, I guess, is, okay, so I'm thinking of our 21-year-old who's now a junior in college. I couldn't get her to watch the shows that I'm most normally on. You know, she's not tuning in for Hardball, but she would tune in for the Colbert Report, or she would tune in for Jon Stewart and The Daily Show. And I guess that's a good thing, because if the alternative is that a generation not be interested, because they're not watching the 6:30 news, the national news, I'd rather have them getting their information somehow.
I want to read about one part of this in this whole discussion in your book. You talk about a time then that Fox News wanted to book you on a program, and during the presidential election, and they said the topic is Obama and his cockiness. We're looking for someone who will say he's cocky and his cockiness will hurt him, if not in the primary, definitely in the general election against McCain. And you were not willing to say that?
Correct.
Is that standard operating procedure for these networks?
I think that it is. That's the reason why I put that email in the book, is because I wanted people to appreciate. This goes back to what I was saying about my perception of the artificial manner of presenting these issues. It's got to be debate, and it's got to be people fighting. So in that instance, my invitation to appear on that Fox program was predicated on my willingness to go on TV and say Barack Obama is too cocky to get elected and to be president of the United States. That wasn't my view. I didn't go on that show. And then what follows is immediately thereafter the same producer says, well, all right, will you come on and say that Hillary is untrustworthy? And no, that wasn't my view, and I didn't go on that program and offer that that opinion. But that's exactly what I'm saying. And I think people at home know this. I just don't know that it's ever been fully acknowledged and appreciated. I don't think you need to get your information by virtue of watching an argument. What's wrong with a host playing devil's advocate and asking questions and either offering their opinion or not offering their opinion, but making sure that all sides get covered? I think you can do that. I try to do that.
In the interest of fairness, you had a similar experience with CNN and the Larry King show.
Well, listen, in the interest of fairness, I've had those experiences everywhere. I've appeared on every program where politics is discussed. I mean, from The View to Bill Maher to the Today Show to Larry King to Hardball. I've done them all. I'm hard-pressed to identify. Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity. I mean, I think this is the way that it goes in most cases. That was a funny episode, though, because this was right before the Pennsylvania primary, and you know, we Pennsylvanians remember that we were the Iowa, we were the New Hampshire, we were the focus of all the attention in a presidential race. And by the way, wasn't that fun? I certainly couldn't get enough of it. And so, okay, I was doing a lot of the media appearances, and I was invited to go on Larry King Live one particular night. Nothing so remarkable about that because of what I do for a living. But the way, Brian, that these shows, I'm sure you know, operate is that prior to the program there will be an interview, and there will be some kind of a discussion with the guest and the producer so that they get an idea of where you're coming from, so that they can factor that into the way in which you will be questioned by the host, in this case Larry King. So I'd gone through an exhaustive pre-interview, offered my views on the presidential election, and then just before the conversation ended, the producer said to me, oh, by the way, we're going to introduce you as a conservative who's supporting John McCain. And I said, well, okay, but neither of those happens to be true. I don't regard myself as a conservative, others do, and I'm not supporting John McCain. And she was flummoxed because, you know, by the script of those particular shows, you've either got to be one or you've got to be the other. You know, how are we going to label you? Labeling is such a part of what is going on out there. And there had to be this negotiation of sorts as to how I was going to be introduced on the program. And I wasn't sure that I would go on the show that night. In other words, I thought that I might get the axe simply because I didn't fit neatly into one of their boxes. The point that I try to make, and I apologize for getting long-winded, is this. This is the big picture. The only individuals that I meet who see the world all one way or all the other, all Republican or all Democrat, all liberal or all conservative, are the people on radio and TV. Because when I'm leading my own life, you know, at our kids' school, going to church, gassing up the car, buying groceries, just meeting real people and having dialogue and discussion, or a cocktail party, or having a beer, I don't meet people who are so doctrinaire in their views. And so that's what I try to say in Morning Drive. I try to say that if you watch the shows, if you listen to these radio programs, you come away with an impression that, well, you've got to be all one way or all the other, or you're the exception. No, you're not. You're the norm. They are the exception. And I think that those programs then become a self-fulfilling prophecy because individuals run for office who fit that mold. They go to Washington or they go to Harrisburg and they think they've got to be that way. You don't. That's just not the way real people function.
Well, how is it that people think you're a conservative if you don't think you are a conservative?
Well, I've never marketed myself, branded myself, gone on the show and said, I'm a conservative, I'm Michael Smerconish. I think that in my own case, I think that most often in the past I've been identified. If you were to watch me on the Today Show, on any number of appearances that I had made, you would have seen under my ugly mug, Michael Smerconish, radio host or conservative radio host. That's not because I said, now call me a conservative. It's because someone in production decided that's the way they would label me. For more than 15 years, I have, in a pro bono capacity, served as Maureen Faulkner's legal counsel. Maureen Faulkner's husband, Danny, was murdered by Mumia Abu-Jamal. So for no money, I served as her lawyer. That's an element. In a very controversial death penalty case, and I'm for the death penalty. I wrote my first book called Flying Blind, in which I embraced the idea of profiling in the war on terror. In other words, I believe that there are common denominators of the terrorists who threaten us, and law enforcement ought to take those factors into consideration. On torture, last night I was on Hardball as a defender of torture. I'm not for torture, but I believe that if we have someone in our custody that we believe to possess information that we could save American lives by getting that information from the person and they don't give it up voluntarily, then we ought to do whatever is necessary to get that information from that person. So, okay, in the world of a television producer, let's see. Well, he must be a skinhead because, after all, look at his hairline. He's for the death penalty. He's also for profiling, and he's for torture. He's a conservative. Maybe. But I'm also somebody who doesn't care about two guys hooking up. I think we ought to legalize pot and prostitution. I wanted us out of Iraq a long time ago. I'm for stem cell research, and I'm pro-choice. So now what am I? And the problem, Brian, is like these TV shows they're like, what the hell? What are we going to call this guy? They're not used to that. They're used to somebody coming in and lining up entirely one way for them and making it easy. But that's not me.
So is that destructive to the political process?
Well, I think it's destructive to the political process if someone like me doesn't get a seat at the table or is given a seat at the table, but is given a seat at the table with a label that doesn't apply. And you know what it ends up doing? We're sitting here in my radio studio having this conversation. If I go on those shows and I'm identified as a conservative, people who listen to me on the radio and really are conservative down the line, they get offended because they think that I've gone on and marketed myself as a conservative. That was another reason why I wanted to write the book. You started by asking me, why do you write a book? What is it that you can't say? This is one of the things I wanted to explain, that when I'm on that program being characterized, it's not necessarily how I've explained myself. It's what somebody sitting in the production room decided they would call me.
Now, you said your political views evolved a lot since you first got involved
Yeah.
with Ronald Reagan in 1980. What did they evolve from to where you are now? And what caused it?
Well, I went to the Central Bucks Public Schools in Bucks County. I had a great education in Bucks County. And in my senior year of high school at CB West, the football powerhouse, I have to throw that in because your Western Pennsylvania people will want to talk about like Penn Hills or some such. No, CB West was always the football powerhouse. Let's just get that clear. But in my senior year, my father, who had not been involved in the political process, he was a guidance counselor in high school, decided he was going to run for an open seat in the Pennsylvania State House. So my spring year of high school, my senior year of high school, I was completely consumed with my father's election. I was knee-deep in all aspects of Dad's race, and I loved it. I got the political bug in the spring of 1980. I was 18. I just registered to vote. Ronald Reagan and George Bush were still competitive in the Pennsylvania primary, and I, Brian, met both of them inside of a week. I met George Herbert Walker Bush when he came to the Shrine of Shenstohova in Doylestown. And then I met Ronald Reagan when a friend of mine, Charlie Giroux, introduced me to him in Esposito's Meat Market on 9th Street in Philadelphia. And all this did was just fuel my enthusiasm for the Republican Party. And I'll come back to your question, but if I may just tell you this one story that's in the book. I then went off to Lehigh University, mistakenly thinking that other college students shared my passion for politics and for Reagan Bush in particular, neither of which was correct. So I formed a club on campus, and I called it Lehigh University Youth for Reagan Bush. And the club couldn't get any traction. It was just a dismal failure. So I had this brainstorm. I would have a keg party, And my keg party would be for all the Reagan-Bush supporters on campus, and surely with the beer, I would draw them out of their dormitories, right? The night that I picked for the kegger was one of the nights, think about this, October 1980. It was the last time the Phillies were in the World Series. And when I tell you that nobody came to the party, I mean nobody came to the party.
Even with free beer?
Even with the free beer. Took it back to my dormitory where all the normal kids were watching the World Series, and we drank the beer anyway. But that ended up creating an opportunity for me because through my club, a Bush campaign operative thought I must really have an organization, and they ended up bringing me into the Bush campaign, and I subsequently became an advance man and ended up working for George Bush when I was 21 years of age. Story unto itself. My point is that I came of age in that era of Reagan. And so I was all enthused about the Reagan-Bush ticket, and in that era, yes, had some very conservative views. As a matter of fact, when I was in law school in 1986, I ran unsuccessfully for the state legislature. And in writing the book, I went back to some documents that I had in my parents' attic, and I found a platform that I had submitted, a questionnaire that I had submitted to a constituent group. And I printed in the book my answers to a number of the questions that they had submitted to me. And I don't recognize that person. It was a very conservative blueprint that I offered back in the 80s.
What caused you to change?
I guess living caused me to change. You know, I think that as people age, most usually when they earn money, you know, they become more conservative, at least in a fiscal sense, and they want to be protective of their nest egg and so forth. What's happened with me is I believe that I'm the same person that I always was relative to national defense, hawkish in national defense. I think that I'm still the same person relative to wanting government to be small and fiscally sound. It's the social issues where I've become more libertarian over time.
How'd you get into talk radio?
Well, so I had these wonderful political experiences at an early age. I was very, very fortunate that when I was young, I was working for George Bush. And when I was young, I was given great responsibility in the Republican Party. My advice, by the way, is to people who are young or those who have kids, get them involved in politics at an early age because it's such a great learning experience. And it was for me. Because I had these unique political experiences while I was young, I was called upon at a pretty early age to be a talking head. Initially, it was some of the local television networks, the networks for the affiliates in Philadelphia, that invited me to be a talking head on election night. Larry Kane is the guy that I really owe a debt of gratitude for, the veteran Philadelphia anchor, for putting me on TV and asking me on election night to speak for the Republicans. And I think the ego of it consumed me, and I wanted to do more of it. And once I was on television, then I was invited to be on radio. And radio is really where I found my calling. I've always been comfortable behind a radio microphone, and I haven't left. I've been consistently on the radio since 1991. You know, and it looks like there was a plan. It looks like there was rhyme or reason to the progression of my career, when in fact it was all happenstance. In other words, I was the guest, and then I was the guest host on Super Bowl Sunday, or they would invite me to be the host on New Year's Eve, you know, all the times when nobody was listening. But then I was given my own show on Sunday nights, and then it was Saturday mornings, and then it was Saturday and Sunday mornings, and then it was an hour in the afternoon, then 2 hours in the afternoon, then 3 hours in the afternoon, and then it was mornings. So, you know, if you look at it on a graph, it looks like it was thought through, but that's just not the way life is.
Did you have people you listened to on the radio when you were growing up?
Well, in a talk sense, you know, there was really one dominant player in Philadelphia. It was WWDB. And my parents would listen to it. So I would listen to it, I guess, through osmosis. I did listen to Sid Mark. And Sid Mark continues to have his Sinatra program on my primary station in Philadelphia, which is 1210 a.m. So it's always been it continues to be a great honor for me to be on a station where Sid Mark is the host.
I want to ask you about hosting. First of all, what's it like to host a program?
Which
When
one?
you're sitting, your morning drive program, when you're sitting behind the microphone, what goes through your head? What are you trying to accomplish?
Some days are better than others. There are plenty of days that I'll walk out that door and have a conversation with my producers, and I'll say, I wouldn't have listened today. Thank God those days are few and far between, but I am very harsh on what I'm doing at all times. I mean, I'm always thinking, is this compelling? Am I saying something that people will want to listen to? I never want to just fill time. You know, I'm responsible for, I think I can say this, more radio content than any other sole broadcaster in the country. I'm responsible for 35 hours a week, 4 hours in the morning and 3 hours midday. I mean, you're interviewing me right now in between my two radio shows. I've already got 4 hours down for today. I've got 3 more to go. Think about that. Think about speaking for 7 hours today and being compelling, not just filling time. I'm not sitting here reading a recipe book. So it's a lot, man. It's a heavy burden. And, you know, to be compelling at all times is an impossibility.
Do you ever lose track of what you've said and repeat yourself within the same hour, or
I
run out of things to say?
There's not an hour that passes without mistakes that I make. Usually they're grammatical. The I and the me thing, Brian and me, Brian and I, is one of my notorious errors. And the callers will call me on it immediately. They let me get away with absolutely nothing. So I've said plenty of stupid things over a long time period, but I've never said anything malicious, and I've never said anything that I've regretted on a substantive level. I've never, I mean, that's really what I'm most proud of is that I've been wrong a boatload of times, but I've never hurt somebody, and I've never, you know, had to offer an apology for something that I've said on the radio.
I want to read something else from your book, and this was a note you got from a consultant named David Hall,
Yeah.
who said, "Dear Michael, these are the things you should look for when you are doing radio. 1, what's this mean? 2, what's coming next? 3, hope but never say it." And then I want to ask you about this number 4 and 5. Callers are here only to make you look even smarter. And number 5, guests are tools. You're the biggest thing in your show. Now, did you take that to heart, or is that the advice he gives for talk show hosts everywhere?
Well, let me give you the context. I had moved from afternoons to mornings. Don Imus had been the morning man on the station, and he just had not clicked in Philly. The numbers were never what the station had hoped that they would be. I was having some success in the afternoon, and the station had said to me over a long time period, we'd like you to move to mornings. And they couldn't get permission from corporate for me to move to mornings, and I was not dying to move to mornings. Who's dying to get up at 3:30 every day, which is when I get up? By the way, if you're dying to get up at 3:30, I will call you. I will be your wake-up service. So when the permission finally came and I agreed and I said I would go to mornings, David Hall was a consultant who was brought in by CBS to try and school me in the differences between afternoon and morning radio. And it's interesting, I thought he had very clear advice, and I think that his advice made a great deal of sense, and that's why I think he wrote that on a napkin at a deli, you know, where we had breakfast one morning, and I saved it and I thought I should put it in the book for the benefit of other talk show hosts. I don't even know if he knows that I've done that. But when you think about the advice, the two things that you draw attention to, I do agree in particular with the caller line. My callers are very important to me, but people are not walking around saying, I listen to Rush Limbaugh because his callers are the best, or I'm never going to listen to Hannity again because I don't like his callers. And he was making that point to me. It's on your shoulders. You know, you need to deliver, and you can't expect to sit back and rely on callers and so forth, because that's not why people are going to come to your program, which also gets back to me saying a while ago that, you know, mentioning abortion may light the phone lines, but it doesn't mean it's something people are going to want to listen to. So callers are there as an element of the program, but you, the host, are the main attraction. I do agree with that. The guest thing, I think it depends on how compelling the guest is. I like having guests. I like having conversations. Some are better than others. Oftentimes, you don't know what you have on your hands until you bring them on the air. That's part of the interest and the excitement of it. And then you get into a situation where maybe it's not what you hoped it would be. How do you shut it down reasonably? If I can tell you a quick funny story that's in the book, speaking of guests, I remember interviewing Jimmy Rollins from the Phillies after he was named MVP. And I was doing the interview from a home studio that I have, and I was about 2 minutes into the interview when I realized I was not recording his voice, and I couldn't fix the problem. It was a technical problem that's beyond me. I'm a knucklehead when it comes to the technical issues. So the dilemma became, should I tell him immediately, or should I continue the interview? Should I continue the interview even though I'm not recording it? How long is it fair to continue the charade now that I know? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? I mean, can I waste the MVP's time for 10 minutes? You know, am I going to look like a complete idiot if I tell him so far I haven't recorded the 2.5 minutes that he'd offered me? It's just funny how you get into these whole things. There was a guest that I really did want, but because of my technical dereliction, I didn't have him on that day.
Who are some of the guests you've had on who are just the toughest interviews, who give you nothing to work with?
Mayor Nutter had been a very tough interview. Just a man of few words and not exhibiting any personality. And then HBO had a show on TV called The Wire. And The Wire was a rough and tumble crime drama set in Baltimore. And somewhere I read or learned that Mayor Nutter was a fan of The Wire. I was a fan of The Wire. So he came on the program and we talked about The Wire and I couldn't shut him up. It was just like he had this side that was there, and I guess I'd never probed and asked the right question. You know, asking about fiscal policy and the city's financial crises is one thing. You ask him about The Wire, you get a whole different guy. So maybe it's not so much the guest as it is whether I knew how to unlock what I needed to do with that person.
Do you have favorites?
Favorite guests?
Yeah.
I think that the favorite guests that I had, it wouldn't be. I mean, I've had great guests. I have had the last, I think it's 5 American presidents. Barack Obama has been on the program, George W. Bush on the program, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, George Herbert Walker Bush, all on the program. If you were to say to me, what's your best radio work? None of them would be on that list. If you were to say to me, what's the most memorable moment of radio in which you've been involved? None of them would be on the list. Good for my ego. Good for me to say, hey, Brian, you know, tell your PCN people I've had 5 presidents on my but not really good radio. Good radio has been, and I get into this in the book extensively, it's one of the things I wish I knew before I started talking. Good radio, let me explain it to you this way if I may. Am I getting too long-winded for you?
Talk away.
Okay. So I was a Seinfeld fan. I love Seinfeld. And in Seinfeld, people who were fans of the series will remember George and Jerry had an idea. They were going to go to NBC. It became sort of a show within a show. They were going to go to NBC and they were going to pitch a TV show. George Costanza and Jerry Seinfeld. What was the show going to be about? It's going to be about nothing. If you remember the whole scene, what's it? It's going to be about nothing. We're going to tell them we want to do a show about nothing. I loved that episode, and there was a lesson in it for talk radio. I wish I'd known this years ago. The shows about nothing are often the best shows. Instead of bogging down on a left-wing, right-wing fight on front-page news, talk about something that everybody can understand, that everybody can comprehend, that's going on in everybody's world. I did a great show on stink bugs. We had stink bugs in our house. I was embarrassed. Because I thought it was like a cleanliness. Where the hell did they come from and what are they? You know, these like hideous little bugs, and they fly at the TV and hit you in the head.
They didn't used to exist.
Right. So finally I mentioned, we got stink bugs. Every line illuminated with people who wanted to talk about stink bugs. And the best part, people had theories about where they came from. You know, I don't know if you ever heard this, but like somebody said, oh, there was an experiment that went bad in Lancaster County. You know, like there's some Jurassic Park in Lancaster County for stink bugs. Stink bugs were great radio. Great radio when our daughter, far younger than she is today, went away to camp. And she'd never been to camp before. She was 8 years old. I tell this whole story in the book, where we took her to North Carolina. It was a camp with a religious foundation. And we dropped her off on a Saturday. We didn't hear from her Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. All of a sudden, Friday, a manila envelope arrives. And in the manila envelope are letters that she has written to us, multiple letters, every day that she's been there. And she is miserable. And she wants to come home. And if you remember Alan Sherman's Camp Granada, hello Mutta, hello Fata, here I am at Camp Granada. The letters were straight out of Camp Granada. And she was begging in increasing frequency to come, please rescue me from camp. And the letters were a stitch, just an absolute stitch to set this up properly. This is our 8-year-old daughter. We live in Pennsylvania. She's in North Carolina. She's at camp for the first time. Letter number 1. Camp is fun. Good sign. At 1, we have lunch. We had today pizza and cheddar cheese, pepperoni, mushrooms, and anchovies, I think. There must have been some talk at that lunch table about the swimming pool, because then she said, I'm off to do test swimming, and there are snakes in there. We chuckled. We read the letter. We thought, hey, this is so far so good. Then things turn. Come, come get me now. I am having no fun. And now I realized, K-N-O-W, now I realized why I sometimes take you for granite, G-R-A-N-I-T-E. I'm sorry. I'm having no fun. I miss you too much. I didn't eat lunch today because I missed you too much. Renee, my counselor, took me to Miss K, the nurse, and now they think I'm a freak. I was literally going to die, D-Y-E, because when I was crying, I did not get enough air. The pool has snakes, jellyfish, and frogs. And the letters then get progressively worse, including her saying at the point that there had been here it is, I hate it. Come get me. I'm sick of the word y'all. And here's your assignment. Get me home or else. Yesterday there was a talent show and I was an Oompa Loompa in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Get me now. Here is my mood. So far I've cried 28 times. Get me out of here, H-E-A-R, okay? A stack of these letters. And they're all signed S-W-A-T, sealed with a tear.
Oh.
So I'm doing afternoons. I go on the air that day with the letters. I read the letters on the radio program. The women called and they said 2 things. 1, this is outrageous that you are reading these letters out loud. You have violated the privacy of your daughter. Second thing that the women would say is, and you should already have gone and gotten her and brought her home. Then the guys would call. And I mean, like, the lines are melting down like it is an abortion or gun conversation. And the guys called and they said, you know, I went to camp, or I was a counselor at camp, or I had a buddy at camp, but they all had this, you know, inside feel. And they said, there was always a kid like yours at camp. And you better let her tough it out or she'll be scarred for life. So the women are saying she'll be scarred for life if you don't go get her. The men are saying she'll be scarred for life if you do get her. By the time I was having the conversation on the air, my wife was already on a plane down south to bring her home from North Carolina. But the point is, it was great talk radio. It didn't come from the front page. It was a parenting issue. It was a lifestyle issue. It was an issue about nothing. But when I say nothing, I mean it was an issue about something in our everyday lives. And I give a laundry list of items like that I've talked about on the radio. Brian, I've distinguished myself on substantive matters by talking for years and writing for years about what I perceive to be the non-hunt for bin Laden. The fact that we outsourced to Pervez Musharraf and Pakistan the responsibility to go get and kill Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. People don't stop me on the street of Philadelphia or when I'm out living my own life and say, hey, can I talk to you about Pakistan? You know, can I share with you my theory about bin Laden? It doesn't happen. But if I'm talking stink bugs, if I'm talking camp letters, I can't walk 10 feet without somebody wanting a piece of me to have a great conversation about life. And that's what I wish I knew before I started talking. I feel like I wasted years of being fixated on the front page.
Well, now there is so much media compared to when you started in radio, so much television, so much internet. What role does radio have? How does it fit into there? What does it contribute to the other media don't contribute?
Like in this building where there are, I think, 4 CBS radio stations, I know that some get nervous about what all this technology means for radio and so forth. Maybe mine is a selfish view. I feel like all of these different outlets need content. And what do? I'm a content provider. So I think a guy like me, there's always going to be room for. And I think that radio, there'll always be a place for. I mean, there's something real. There's something tangible. There's something about driving in your car and having a crackling AM radio bring you a Phillies game. I don't know. Maybe it's just a sign of my age. Maybe it's because that's the way that I was raised, and that's the way that I think that it has always been and always should be. But I don't see any signs of radio dying as long as radio maintains conversancy and topical significance.
Now, you also do 2 newspaper columns, one for the Inquirer, one for the Daily News?
Yeah, Daily News every Thursday, Inquirer every Sunday.
Available online?
Yes.
What's the value of newspapers now?
Oh man, I hope newspapers stay. I hope that they survive because I think that there's no substitute yet for investigative journalism that comes from newspapers. And I think that no amount of blogging by people in their pajamas can make up for the role that newspapers have played historically. I mean, you can think about a national issue like Watergate. You can think about the NSA wiretapping and a guy at the New York Times named James Risen who uncovered that whole element. There's so many things as a watchdog role the newspapers have fulfilled. I mean, here in Pennsylvania, I question whether the prosecution of Senator Fumo would have gotten to where it was and ended up where it did, but for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Many, many times I haven't liked the newspapers. I've been a vocal critic of the Inquirer and the Daily News in this part of the state. But they play a valuable role. And I don't see anyone picking up the mantle. If the newspapers fall, here's the line I like to use. We need these guys to watch those guys. These guys are the newspapers, and we need them to watch the politicians. That's what I think.
What about other media? Magazines?
I'm not a big magazine guy. Magazines for me are laughs and giggles. If I'm into a magazine, that's because I really want to get out of the news of the day. So I think that they play that role for me and for others. At least those that are pure entertainment. Frankly, I think that the ones that may suffer, and this is just a hunch, a gut instinct, I don't have any inside information, but I think that the news magazines could be in trouble. The U.S. News, the Newsweek, the Times, whereas a Rolling Stone or a Vanity Fair, I think, is going to have more permanence.
How do you keep up with the news?
I'm a news junkie. I'm never tuned out. If it's a day off, I'm still not only online, but touching and reading 4 or 5 newspapers a day. I am old school when it comes to the newspapers. There's not enough online for me. You lose things when you read a newspaper online. So, I guess I can explain it this way. A typical day for me is me touching and reading the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Daily News, USA Today, the New York Times, and USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal, pardon me. And then online getting a whole host of other news outlets that I will peruse quickly. And I love that. The newspapers are very important to me. I'm caught up in the cable world. The one thing I really don't get a chance to do is listen to much radio.
When you're on a guest on MSNBC or any of the other, how does that work? How do they call you up and...
Well, I can tell you what happened last night. So yesterday I get an email midday. And we'd like to have you on Hardball tonight. Are you available? This is for a hit at 5:30. The subject will be Dick Cheney saying that the memos that showed the efficacy, the success rate of torture should be released. We'd like you to talk about that with Chris. And so after I've hosted 2 radio programs, picked up my son at school, worked briefly on a column, gotten back into the shower, had my head powdered, I find myself now, sitting in a chair in a satellite studio where I'll spend 10 minutes on hardball, which I did last night.
Where do you do that?
I do that from the NBC affiliate where they've built a studio, and it's in close proximity to the studio in which we're now seated. Sometimes I go into town to Modern Video, where I've had a long-standing relationship, but satellite studios are where I do the interviews.
Now, you do that fairly regularly. Do you get paid for that?
I do. I have a contract with MSNBC and NBC, so I'm exclusive to them, and I'm contractually obligated to appear 2 or 3 times a week on one of those networks.
You make no bones about the fact you would like to have your own national TV show.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I should put that in past tense. I don't know how to describe that today, but I make no bones about it in the book that on any number of occasions in the past, I wanted that, and I thought it was going to happen. But in that respect, I've always been the bridesmaid and never the bride. I had a number of instances where I thought this is really going to happen, and it didn't. But it is something that I really did want.
I want to ask you throw out some names and have you just comment on them more.
Okay.
What your impressions of Governor Rendell?
I like him very much. I thought he was I still think of him as the mayor, because knowing him the way that I do, I always thought he was so well suited to that role. I was completely hands-on, paying attention when he was elected, and I never thought he was going to win. Back in 1991, in that multi-candidate Democratic field, I didn't give him a prayer. And not only did he win, but he turned out to be a hell of a mayor for 2 terms. I thought he was just a terrific, terrific mayor. And on a personal level, I like him very much. I mean, he blurbed the book. There are a number of issues that we disagree with in national politics, but on a personal level, I like the guy. I get a kick out of the guy. I think that what you see is what you get. There's a level of honesty that comes forth with him that you don't get it. He's not one of these blow-dried, cautionary, very soundbite. You ask him a question, he'll tell you what he thinks. I like that.
Arlen Specter.
Well, Specter to me has been somewhat of a political mentor. I'm worried about him. I'm worried about the primary election that will be held in Pennsylvania next year. I think that we need more Arlen Specters, more individuals who are bright, who are independent, and who are not beholden to the fringes of either party. I mean, this takes me back to where we began this conversation about how I see people getting elected and going to Harrisburg or Washington who they emulate the talking heads on TV, and they become doctrinaire types, uncompromising and so forth. Arlen Specter is a guy that I respect even when I disagree with him, because I know that he is so well informed and so conscientious and hardworking. So I like him very, very much.
Frank Rizzo.
Rizzo is a guy that I had the privilege of working for. It was a relationship that began as a pen pal relationship. I miss him greatly. I tell some stories about him in the book. There are many times, Brian, where something will go on in the world, and I wonder, how would Frank Rizzo react to that? How would Frank Rizzo look at this person? I don't know about you, but there are people that I've lost that continue to be voices in my head. And if I'm confronted with a dilemma, it's almost as if I can call upon them. By the way, I don't mean this in like some Nancy Reagan wacky way, but I mean I knew them so well that I know what their advice would have been. Frank Rizzo is one of those people. Herb Barness, who was a Republican National Committee man in Pennsylvania, one of those people. Jim Beasley, a lawyer for whom I worked, one of those people. Where, Jay Waldman, a federal judge, one of those people. Where I know how Jay would have looked at this situation. I know how Rizzo would have looked at this situation. And I just feel that I was so fortunate to have spent time with Rizzo the way in which I did.
You said that Ronald Reagan was the first campaign you got involved with.
Yeah.
What do you think of Ronald Reagan now, looking back 20 years after he left office?
Well, I hold him still in high regard. It's interesting. Reagan, spawned this renewal of conservative thought, but he was also a tolerant guy. Ronald Reagan to me was not the uncompromising ideologue, not the doctrinaire sort. And I wonder how Reagan would perceive some of the issues of the day. Ronald Reagan, the great conservative leader, frankly, I think that Ronald Reagan would have had an openness toward some of the business with same-sex relationships, by way of example. I think that some people look back at his memory, and maybe I'm the one mistaken, but I think that they look back at his memory and they don't really understand what he stood for. Barry Goldwater, the same kind of a thing. I mean, Barry Goldwater said, let's get government off our backs and out of our bedrooms. And yet the same people who carry that mantle today, that conservative mantle, they very much want to be in your bedroom. The Terry Schiavo case was a great example of that.
You have something in your book, Morning Drive, called the Suburban Manifesto.
Yeah.
That is woven throughout the book. Is there a common thread of belief that ties all your opinions together that are in the Suburban Manifesto?
That is a great question, and I think that the answer is probably no. If I may just give you the background on that, what happened is that really was the seed that grew into this book. In 2006, the Republican Party got hammered in the midterm elections. And people were then thinking, what does the party represent? What does the party stand for? And I was wondering, as I saw the way the party was drifting to the right, whether this was still my party. So as an exercise, I put pen to paper and I wrote a column for the Philadelphia Daily News, and I called it my Suburban Manifesto. And it was me on 15 points. Me on the hunt for bin Laden, me on global warming, me on stem cell research, on immigration, on a whole host of whatever the push-button issues were of the day. Entitlements, I mean, you name it, I addressed it. And I was able to do this in like 800 words. Here's how I see these 15 issues. I published the column. I came in on the radio and I offered those 15 points. And I set up my website as a site where you then could go and vote. And you could vote whether you agreed or disagreed with me on those 15 issues. 3,500 people, round number, in one weekend did that, which is a pretty healthy sample, 3,500 people. And generally they agreed. I think the number was like on average with 10 of my 15 points. And I then started to analyze the reaction that I got and from where it was coming, southeastern Pennsylvania, on those issues. And it caused me to think that I was onto something with my views and my opinion that the Republican Party is out of touch with what's going on. I am somebody who believes that as go the Philly suburbs, will go not only Pennsylvania, but also the nation. And I think that the recent election was a great example of that. And I may be sometimes out of the mainstream with my own callers, who tend to be very conservative, but I believe I am very much in the mainstream of suburban Philadelphia, consequently of Pennsylvania and of the nation. So I offer it as somewhat of a blueprint for what I think the party needs to be, the Republican Party, to get back on track. And in a nutshell, it is libertarian on the social issues. Stay out of people's way. Live and let live. Let that person lead their life and you lead yours, and hopefully the two don't have to intertwine all that much. Be tough on defense and return to a small era of government. That's really what I'm all about. What's the common denominator in that? I guess only that they're my views, and I think they're views held by a lot of other folks.
Well, if that's the mainstream,
Yeah.
as you said, why doesn't it hold sway with either party?
Well, I think that the Republican Party is being held captive by its more extreme elements, and maybe the Democratic Party is as well, but the Democrats have been more big tent oriented than the Republicans in the last several cycles. And frankly, the Republicans don't appear to me to have learned from their mistakes.
We only have a couple minutes left. Your parents grew up in Hazleton?
Yeah, Mom and Dad are both from Hazleton. My father's from Audenried. My mother is from West Hazleton. Mom is one of 11, 8 sisters and 3 brothers. And we still have a lot of relatives in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Did you spend much time in Hazleton when you were
Not as much, growing up, a ton. Not as much now as I would like to. But, there's a whole network of cousins, still is, but everybody goes their own ways, unfortunately. And I guess my grandmother, who we lost at 101, was a linchpin of sorts that kept everybody coming home. And unfortunately, with her passing, there's not as much visitation. And I've got 4 kids of my own now, but I have wonderful memories of many, many weekends spent in Hazleton. And I get that whole Northeast Pennsylvania mentality of Eastern European roots and hardworking and great cooks.
Smerconish is Eastern European what?
Yeah, the name. My mother is Yugoslavian. My father is Italian and Ukrainian, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I am involved in a never-ending roots search where I've nailed mom's background, nailed my dad's Italian background, and still in the hunt for all the answers on the Austria-Hungarian issue.
We only have a couple minutes left. In your book, you talk about some fun places, some cool places you've gotten to go and things you've gotten to do because you do what you do for a living. What are some of the fun places you've been?
Well, I guess as a broadcaster, I've had great opportunities with the Phillies. I mean, one of the things I get to do is our sons are 8, 10, and 12. So I spend usually sometime, a couple of days in Clearwater in the spring when the Phillies are in the Grapefruit League, and that's always been great. Now everybody's on that bandwagon. I've been there for years because the Philly radio station that carries me is the home of the Philadelphia Phillies. A lot of great political experiences. You know, I said to you earlier that I've had 5 American presidents. They haven't been my best radio, but they've been awfully exciting to host on the air. Barack Obama, now President Obama, was my guest 3 different times during the presidential contest. John McCain, I hosted in Philadelphia. And like you, I'm an avid reader, and I love interviewing authors. And I enjoy that. I mean, that's somewhat of a guilty pleasure, is the idea that if I read a book and that I'm really taken with it, hey, I can call that person up and interview them, and I do that.
You host a book club in Philadelphia?
We have live events and call it my book club. The joke is it's the only club I can get into, my own book club, that and Sam's Club. So yeah, I'll do that as well. Host authors.
Open to the public?
Yeah.
And if somebody wants to, you mentioned your website. What is that?
Okay. I recently changed to mylastname.com, smerconish.com. It's a mouthful, SMERCONISH.com.
And again, if somebody wants to listen to you on the radio, where can they find you?
TheBigTalker1210.com. Or hopefully one of the growing lists of affiliates.
And newspapers?
Inquirer on Sundays, Philadelphia Daily News on Thursdays.
We are out of time. Our guest has been Michael Smerconish, author of this book, Morning Drive. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.